Hi guys, welcome to second episode of new series about the programming. Uh, Last time we specified we gathered some information about the chess game, and we prepared some, let's say, contract. What do we have on our chart? So we know that we are going to implement network game. There will be some nodes that allows to play player versus player without server, but they will also be able to connect with other clients like this one, for example. And this is just a client without possible player to player versus player game. And we agreed to exchange data using JSON format. Here we have some definition. This is the board game, figures. Some would say that pawn is not a figure, but from the development point of view, pawn is also a figure. And there are players, and there's our start platform. As the first series is about PHP. So here we have at least three elements that we need to somehow specify how to describe them, how to implement them. Because 8x8, like a board, let's say here, in a real game, it's an array with 1 to 8, and from A to H. Yeah, so this is 8x8. And we can specify this as a two-dimensional array, because that's how it looks like. We may specify this as a single one-dimensional 64 elements array. Yeah, so that's what we need to figure how to present this in our application. We have figures and players. And so let's say that player for now, as usual, needs some ID and some name. Figure would require some type and also a player, but as a relation. One player may have multiple figures. We do not specify relation between figures and boards because that's obvious. All figures have to be somehow on the board. And as usual, there are multiple ways to do a thing, or to skin a cat, however you want to call it. So let's code one thing and see if that will work for us. Yeah, here I have an empty Visual Studio project. Let's start typically like index.php. And let's say we would like to have it in a quite object-oriented way. Yeah, so we need to define those elements. So before we start coding, we would like to use something like a namespace, and it will be chess. So let's create a folder. It's a chess. Okay. New file. Board PHP. Player PHP. And figure.php. In a board we can define some class like this way, but as we said, it will be a namespace chess. Okay, so it's a empty blueprint. Copy here. Here we are going to change to figure, and here it will be a player. So let's start with defining a board. We need to store information about the figures somehow. So let's say it will be protected figures, and let's start with a simple array. And for now we will implement just one function. It will be public add figure, and it's a figure like this way. Public function, obviously. Okay, and it's okay, so very basic implementation of a board is done. Now we can this is a pure PHP, so there's no composer, no auto includes. Everything is done pretty raw way. So first we need to require once chess board. Now let's define board object. We can do this way or this way, both works. We are in a PHP 7 plus. Okay, and let's say we would like to have a figure, say new figure, no names so far. Yeah, but let's stay with the one convention. And board, figure, and figure. So our first figure was added to our board, but that obviously is not. We don't have enough information to say anything about this figure. What kind of it's a king, pawn, who owns this figure. So let's specify a figure a little bit more. We will have multiple figures, so we can wrap them in a new namespace. It will be chess, but let's say it will be another subset figure. And also let's say we would like to specify some more precise type of figures. So this class we may abstract. It will be very generic blueprint, so we don't want to initiate and work with objects of type figure. What do we need? We need a constructor. And because I would like to show you something on my Windows where I have PHP 8, not 7 as specified, I will use some shorthand. This construction works in a PHP 8 only, and what it does, it is like a chess player. Here I would have to remove this. So it is equal to this one, but let's keep it short. And if you can specify a player, let's say that we would like to add some getter, to fetch information about who owns this figure. Okay, so getter is done. Now we can go to player and see what do we have here. As we said, we need some ID and some name. Let's use this shorthand. It's a public ID and public name. Okay, so we have defined name and ID of a player. Here we changed a namespace of our figure because, as you can see, chess figure is undefined, and that's because we changed the namespace to chess figures. So it's figures and figure. That's the correct namespace for figure. Now let's go back to index. Now we have to adjust our figure definition. First we need to change the namespace. It's a figures figure, like this one. That's the full, and as you can see, this is still wrong because we specify one new parameter. So let's create a player 1 is equal to new chess player ID. Let's say it's a 1 player 1. And now we can provide this as a parameter, and everything should be fine so far. So let's dump our board. We will see what our board holds. You can use built-in console terminal in Visual Studio Code. Go to View and Terminal. It will open immediately in a folder of your project. So here you can have index.php. Let's run it and see what do we have. And that's exactly what we expected. We changed our class to figure to abstract, and that's why we cannot instantiate it, even though this linter in a Visual Studio accepts this. So that's time to specify some more specific figures. And let's start with a king. We can create a new folder or use some naming convention in the files. So let's keep it simple for now. It's a figure king.php. We know that we are in a chess figures namespace, and class is king, and we would like to extend our figure. Yeah, so now we have a class to specify a king. Now we can go back to index, change our figure to king, and see what we have in our terminal. Yep, it will work better if we add this definition here as well. Let's make it bigger. Yeah, and that's what we have in our console. We have our board with figures, with one figure, and the figure is a king, and king belongs to player 1. So far everything seems to be okay. So as a figure, except besides ownership, we also need some definition of the position on the board. We know that it belongs to the board, but we need to know where it will be. So let's create an position class. As usual, namespace will be chess. And what do we need here? We need a row and column. Sometimes in official documentation there is also a file as a replacement for row, I guess. But as a developers, we are more familiar with rows and columns, so let's keep it like this. Okay, so we have position class defined, and now we would like to have it in figures. But this is something mandatory for all figures. So let's go to our abstract class and make it required as a second parameter. Okay. Visual Studio already marked this file as a wrong file, so let's specify some position. It's equal to new chess position, and let's say it's a king, so it's a position number 1 and row number 5 and position. This way we have specified one figure, where is it located, who owns this, and we are ready to implement the other figures. But before we go any further, let's see what we can also add to king to see how and if that works. We know that every figure would have to implement at least one method, and this method will be move. So it will be public abstract, and because we already defined a new class position, we can use this as a parameter because we already know how it was structured. And in this way we enforce on every class that inherits after this, that derived classes, we enforce them to implement that at least that one method. And let's go back for a second to our chess specification, just to take a breath. We defined that we have some moves, and as we can see, some moves are common. Yeah, for example, queen and rook and bishop. Yeah, they move more or less the same. I mean, of course, queen have more moves allowed, but this doesn't change this move itself. So I think it makes sense to implement the movements in an abstract class and then use it if it's correct, if it's appropriate for the particular figure. But let's start from something that we have to implement. It's a public function move, and it is chess position, and it is 2. And to keep it simple, before we do any movement, we need to validate it. And because some moves, many moves can be shared, I mean, are common, we would like to move it to the abstract class. So I will just call something like if validate move, and because it's a king, king can move in any direction. So let's say we call it asterisk, and what we need to specify is 2. If that validation is correct, we can specify that this position is equal to 2. Obviously this method is not implemented yet, so we need to go here and implement it, because we don't want to expose this method to other developers. It should be called internally in a move method. I will make them protected. Obviously it's a function. And how to validate this movement? So the easiest way is to subtract position from the other position and see if the difference in rows or columns is equal to 1. Yeah, because in any direction king can move only one field. So let's go to position for a second. And because we would like to subtract, so let's implement. It is not we cannot override symbols in a PHP, but we can define functions. So let's say public function subtract. We expect position, and we would like to also return a position here. Okay, I think it's pretty straightforward. We have rows, columns, and we subtract, we return this object. So now we can go to figure, and because this subtraction modifies the original object, so let's make a clone. Clone. Okay. And so we have a copy of our position. Now we can subtract. And return. What do we want to return? We may have positive or negative values. So we would like to wrap everything in ABS. And check if it's equal to 1, or ABS position column is equal to 1, like this. Okay, so we have a pretty simple validation move for a king. Here is our king, and we can simply check if that works. So let's say if we have, this is a origin, that will be a destination. Here we change to origin. Yeah, and so far it should be okay. Of course, we do not validate if the row or column is in a negative scope yet. We are checking just if it's a move on by one field. So here we have defined a king, here it was added to a board. Here we dump, so we should see the king with those coordinates, and if those are allowed, we should see them in a second dump. So let's add echo dump 1 and that line, and the same here. Let's see what do we have. Yeah, as usual, code works better if defined. Voila. So what do we have in dump number 1? It's a board with one figure, which is a king, belongs to our player 1, and position is 1, 5. Then we changed our position to destination, which would be row 2, column 5. Yeah, so still we have still one figure, the same owner, and it was allowed. It's a 2 and 5. So let's see if we will try to move 2 fields. This is the first dump, and in the second dump you can see it is still in the old position, which means that our validator works as expected. So having this done, we can remove this movement, this one. Okay, so we have a player 1. Now we need to define player 2. Let's say like this. And let's call this king 1. King 2. King 1. King 2. Like this way. This way. And this is row number 8. Okay, let's see one more time what do we have in our log. Yeah, so now we have one board with 2 elements. The first element belongs to player 1, it's a king, and it is positioned on a row 1 and column 5. The second element belongs to player 2, and it is positioned on the 8th row and column 5. Okay, and as you can see, this is quite object-oriented programming, that's for sure, but it seems to be overwhelming a bit. Let's move it to the a separate folder and try maybe something a little bit simpler. I moved everything to the OOP, like object-oriented programming folder. Here we have all our code, but let's go back to our documentation and see what we can simplify. So let's start with the figures, as there seems to be the most complex part. Based on a specification from the official International Chess Federation, we can, let's move it to the right for a second. We can use some short names, and pawn is called P, bishop is called B, knight, because there is also a king, is knight, rook, queen, and king, because we need to specify, we need to be able to distinguish figures and the owner of the figure. So if we use this alphabet letters, we have two sets, small and capital letters. So it is very easy if we use small letters for one player and capital letters for the second player. And with this approach, let's go to see how to code it. So let's start with the index PHP again. There's PHP, and we start with defining a board immediately. And board will be an array. Here we would have to pause for a second one more time, because as I mentioned previously, we can define board as a two-dimensional array with 8x8 rows and columns. We can also define this as a one-dimensional array with 64 elements. In PHP, we can even specify this as a string, but you would like to exchange data between clients and server and so on. And obviously, we would have to do some transformation from JSON to the language that we are going to use, but we would like to keep this transformation as simple as possible. So we should use a format that will be the easiest to transform for as many languages as we can imagine. So that I would not recommend to use a string, because strings in languages like Python are difficult to modify, let's say. In Java, there are some builders and so on. So let's keep it as a one-dimensional array, and it will be profitable in the future. You will see. But for now, you need to believe me. Okay, so how to specify it? We know that we have a rook. There's a knight. There's a bishop. King, queen, another bishop, another knight, and rook. Then we have row of pawns. And this one. Yep. Now we have empty fields. And we can do this in two ways, like this one or like this one. I would say that having a space instead of empty is a bit more convenient. I mean, this should be more bugs prone, I suppose. Because if we have a space, we know that we have to check for a space, not for something empty. Like this. And we have 4 of them, and now and rook. And that's our board. We have, in a simple one-dimensional array, specified all positions of all figures, owners. It's very easy to distinguish which figure belongs to who. Position already, and I suppose that this approach is a way simpler, and that's the approach I'm going to choose for the next lessons, next episodes. That's all about this in this episode, and we'll continue in the next one. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.